we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Energy Impact Centre podcast. Today, we are coming from the UK again, and we are joined by another esteemed person from the UK energy field. We're joined by Guy Newey from Energy Systems Catapult. Guy, good morning.
Morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm locked in a booth, so there's no background noise, hopefully. And I've got you unobstructed for 30 minutes, which is exciting.
Fantastic. I'm delighted to be here.
So what I'd love you to start with, Guy, is just telling us a little bit. I think our listeners are always interested to find out, how did people end up doing what they do, and how did you end up in your role? What's your history? What's your background?
So I had a very strange journey into clean energy and where I've ended up now at the Energy Systems Catapult. So I after university, I was a journalist. So I was a journalist for 3 or 4 years in Birmingham in the UK. So covering crime and murder and courts and fires and all of that exciting stuff. And then I went, after I kind of done my training as a cub reporter in Birmingham, I went over to Hong Kong and reported on Hong Kong and China for a newswire called AFP, Agence France. And I was writing about the growth of China, really, and the boom in China. 2006 to 2009, I was out there, Beijing Olympics, all the challenges there. And I got into energy and environment issues because I was in Hong Kong, and I had this wonderful office on the 62nd floor overlooking Victoria Harbour in Hong Kong, which is one of the world's kind of great vistas. And probably for a third of the days of the year, couldn't see anything out the window because the pollution was so bad.
Right.
And I guess I got hooked on that question of, could you have all the benefits of growth that you were seeing for China and for Chinese people, and coming out of kind of, decades of backbreaking poverty? Could you have all of the benefits of that without screwing up your environment, whether it's air pollution or climate change, etc. And I started writing about that story more and more. And unlike lots of journalists, I realized I needed to know more about it. And so I did, and went back to university, went back to college in the UK, and did a master's in energy.
That's brave.
Yeah, it was kind of 30, 31, just got married. I was quite a catch, like, great, I'll now become a student again. So did that, went to Imperial College in London and did that for a year. And then got involved in policy, energy and environment policy at think tanks in London. And then eventually started working for OVO Energy, which was then is kind of one of the big suppliers in the UK now, one of the big energy retailers. It was a kind of upstart, growing very fast, medium-sized enterprise.
It was a challenger brand, wasn't it?
It was a very much challenger brand, causing trouble, trying to disrupt, all of that really exciting stuff.
And then they doing simple. Well, I was going to say, also doing really revolutionary things like serving customers, answering the phone, billing people with accurate data.
That's right. All these radical propositions, which were, quite transformative. For
it worked. Business did well, didn't it? Yeah.
So, so did that.
And what were you doing there? What was your role?
So I was on the policy side. So I was, head of policy at OVO, trying in many ways to grapple with the question of, you're growing this fast, you're trying to do things totally different in the energy industry, but it's a really heavily regulated and kind of policy intensive industry for all sorts of sensible safety reasons, etc. How do you push up against the boundaries of what's acceptable from the regulator, that allows the innovation is better for consumers and for the planet, and but doesn't get you into too much trouble? And that was basically my job, trying to keep everyone.
It's quite an interesting one, because for me, one of the challenges I think with policy in energy is that you have to get quite specific quite quickly. You can't just deal in general platitudes and big statements. You've got to get, and that's a really good example of that. Can you talk a little bit about some of the specificity that you had to kind of get into as the guy fresh out of Imperial College who'd been a journalist, who's suddenly sitting with ministers going, I need to talk to you about metering specifications?
Yeah, it was. I've done 3 or 4 years beforehand, so I had a bit more kind of energy experience before I got to OVO. The big question when we were there was actually about kind of, well, there were various things around smart metering and how we were doing the rollout of smart metering in the UK, which were a bit of a challenge, and certainly risked hindering some of the kind of flexibility innovations which we were trying. I guess my lesson on how you tell that story with regulators or ministers is don't dive into the detail too quickly and
too quick
you're telling the story, right? The key is, this is the big picture we're trying to get to. You agree with that? Here's one of the things that's relatively small that could be transformative for my business, but we don't really see as the risk. And the energy industry is full of these weird anomalies, whether it's kind of, how far, if you install a heat pump, how far that can be from your neighbor's fence, to lots of stuff around metering, grid connections, which are just not going to be fit for purpose in the world we're moving to. So yeah, my steer at that point was try and tell it so you can show why it's better for consumers. Don't start with why it's better for us as a business. Right.
And how do you do that? Can you give us some live examples of how you create that kind of longer term picture of how something is better for a consumer group or for supply chain to roll out, or to regulate? Actually, like, something being easy to regulate is also sometimes quite a good driver.
Yeah, I mean, it depend on different situations, but the big one is, if you're talking to government in the UK or a European context, is, everyone talks about this smart, flexible, renewable heavy system that we're gonna move towards, and there's general consensus about that at a kind of conceptual level, that's what
the big picture view.
The big picture view. But then you get into the important thing, and I think it's important for everyone in the transition to think about, is this is an enormous transition, and the implementation challenge is not just a technology challenge. It is about business models, it's about interoperability, it's about all of those questions, and those are as big challenges as can we make a wind turbine a third of the price, or can we get the cost of nuclear power down? All of those questions, and you need to tell that big picture. You need to tell that big picture story, because the danger is that everyone buys into the kind of future vision and then doesn't realize how difficult it is to get there, and how risky it is to get there. And I think that's where we are on the kind of story. You need to get people excited about that transformative vision, and then you need to get them kind of sober about how significant the change is.
It's funny because my dad worked in the telecoms networks between the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, and early noughties, and he was one of the guys that went around Europe switching analog to digital. And the scale of transformation and investment that had to happen, particularly in the 80s, was ridiculous. But the thing that and it was a less complex system than the energy system is, the telecom system. It's just lots of wires and hubs, connectors. But actually, the thing that happened relatively quickly was that you had agreement on how you were going to do it at quite a high level.
Yeah.
Like some principles got mapped out relatively early between the telecoms businesses, but also with governments. So like, we need to do it like this, which meant that suddenly you had interoperability. You could do the same thing in the UK that you could do in Belgium, and you didn't end up with weird local systems. And it strikes me that energy could learn a little bit from this, but also the system's very complicated. The energy system's very complicated, and we are moving from a dumb system where you kind of I had a friend who used to describe it as a vegan friend who used to describe it as it was like foie gras, a goose. It was, you stuff as much energy down a pipe as you possibly can, and the consumers at the other end gobble it up, and no one cares. And we need to move to a much more sophisticated system. How have you been able to? I know this is spinning away from your history, but how have you been successful in the last sort of 15 years of getting stakeholders to buy into that? It's not the conceptual vision, it's that next level down. It's the okay, and therefore strategically this is what we therefore need to do. Have you got some examples of where that's starting to work?
You've had some success. It's a good question. I mean, if I look over the last 15 years since I first started writing about it then, but now delivering on the innovation,
doing it,
is how we were nowhere in 2006, 2007. It was kind of, there's big stories about, somebody's been able to put up a wind turbine in West Wales, and it's operational now, so it can power half a kettle being built.
250 kilowatts.
I exaggerate, right? It was a real kind of cottage industry, and now you've got on the scale we're talking about, absolutely huge. So the way I tend to think about it, in the last 15 years, we've been incredibly successful, particularly around the kind of upstream technologies. So in particular, renewables, wind, solar, but also electric vehicles. So we on a technology kind of S-curve, as it were. We're at that stage where it's going absolute gangbusters, and making huge progress and huge strides. On the next wave of challenges, I always think these things are come in waves. On the next wave of challenges, which is the thing I and my team at Energy Systems Catapult start thinking more about, which is about what you say about how all this is actually going to work, right? How is the energy system, I'll include transport in that, how is that actually going to work together? And the truth is, I think we're only in the foothills of that, right? We're only in the foothills of understanding what digitalization is going to do to energy in the way that it has changed telecoms and obviously other industries in a significant way. But energy is still really unsophisticated by comparison. And so how you're going to get that kind of integration of those technologies, how are you going to make sure that it all works in practice when you've got 40 million electric vehicles and 30 million heat pumps on the system, or whatever the numbers are? I think we're only starting to grapple with that, which is a risk, because we are piling on more,
running out of time.
Well, we're running out of time in terms of climate change, and and from a system integrity point of view, we're piling on more and more renewables technologies, which is a fantastic success story, but creates challenges for our system. And you're just starting to see the system in the UK context, and it's happening in loads of other markets, starting to creak, and those creaks are going to get louder if we don't sort it out.
Well, right. I mean, I think this year we've had more coal used this winter to generate power, for example, for exactly that reason. And interestingly, one of the challenges is we're decommissioning all of our nuclear baseload in the UK, but we're not replacing it with new nuclear baseload fast enough. So, what's the quickest, easiest thing you can turn on? Coal and gas. So unfortunately, the proliferation of renewables in the UK, which is, I agree with you, a huge success story, is having a flip-on effect, which is to offset that variable generating load, you need that base load, and the only base load available is coal and gas. So we're increasing the amount of coal and gas that we're generating now, which is a shame. So let's go back to your back to your journey then, right? So you were an OVO, you had the policy role, you were trying to convince government that, you know, there was a better way of serving customers than the crappy old big six. No, we'll answer the phone when he gets to you. And a smart digital future was part of it. And then you moved into politics, didn't you?
Yes. So the 2015 election happened in the UK, and rather to everyone's surprise, the Conservative Party became the majority party. And because of various contacts I had, I knew there was a chance of me getting a role as what's called a special advisor in the UK context. So somebody who is the kind of right-hand person to the person who runs the department, the Secretary of State. At that time was Amber Rudd. And I managed to get that job as special advisor. They tend to have 2 or 3 doing that. And so I went from kind of
How do you get that job? Describe the process of getting that job. There's people who listen to this and be like, "Ooh, that sounds cool. I'd like to be a SPAD." How did it happen?
So I've been, because of the job before OVO and because of OVO, I've been in the kind of policy world for probably 4 or 5 years. So I worked at a think tank. Right. And so I got to know loads of people in government on the civil service side, lots of politicos, lots of energy industry people of different sorts. And so my network was kind of strong. The truth is, you know, these things are a bit opaque how you actually get the job. I just needed to get my CV into the hands of, ultimately to Amber Rudd, but I couldn't get to her directly. So how do I get it through other people? So it's a bit kind of who you know kind of questions. And there was a process as well that they went through and interviewed a few people after that. But the truth is,
you also had to be good.
That's well, others can make that judgment. But it was a bit of kind of who do you know and a lot of what do you know, because that's certainly what Amber was interested in. Is, you know, she was interested in my take on what the top 5 things we've got to do.
What's she going to bring you? But what are you going to bring her? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about this SPAD role then.
So I did 3 years inside government in various different advisor roles, one for Amber Rudd and one for others. And I think these are incredibly intense roles inside government, because you're basically trying to avoid the minister making any massive cock up. That's at the heart of what you're trying to do, as well as trying to drive them forward. So the primary job is to first of all, make sure, you know, read everything that the department is putting out. And when I say everything, you know, you get what are called ministerial boxes, which come through, and they're kind of, you know, an inch thick every night. And I'm reading that 2 or 3 days before it go to the minister to try and, you know, give a political read or a kind of risk read on any of that. So there's just a vast amount of material to cover. So anything that happened in energy for 3 years, I read all of it. That was one part of it. Secondly is then, you know, the most precious, like anyone running any business, the most precious asset for a minister is time. And there are endless calls on their time. So a big part of what I saw as my role is, how do you prioritize the areas that are really important for Amber's success and what we want to do, and then you try and organize her diary around that, and etc. Because there's so many calls on pressure to meet people and see others, that if you don't do that, you know, same way that anyone in any job, if they don't prioritize properly, they're never going to achieve anything that they need to. So that was a big part of the focus. Bits of dealing with the media, bits of trying to get the department to do things that the ministers wanted to do, but it was just a kind of, you know, absolutely full on, you know, never, you know, phone was always on,
relentless,
working every weekend, all that.
And you didn't fancy doing that for the rest of your life and staying in politics?
I did that for 3 years, and it was absolutely incredible job, because, you know, it's the old Hamilton line, being in the room where it happens is incredibly is just wonderful.
It's intoxicating.
It is intoxicating is the right word. I think what I found after 3 years is I became a person who knew how to say no to lots of things, and stopped being the slightly naive person at the start who would say, no, we can close coal-fired power stations, or we can take a risk here, etc. And I think once you become that kind of voice of no rather than that voice of yes in those roles, then you're not adding anything. So I, for all sorts of reasons, I kind of decided it was time to leave. It was also, to be frank, a pretty frustrating times generally in UK.
Yeah, tough time.
Our exit from the European Union, all of those questions, that was dominating political attention. So being able to grapple with the kind of big energy questions was just
bad timing. And actually, it's interesting how much of what's been successful in UK energy came out of the policies that were written in the sort of 2000 and I kind of want to say like 7 to like 13, 14 age, right? Where you had that period, especially that Cameron came in was it 2010? And really put a sort of turbo up the wind industry in a big way. But yes, I think last 5 years particularly, we've seen a slowdown in momentum. So anyway, tell us about the Energy Systems Catapult, because that was the move, right?
So after I left government, I joined the Energy Systems Catapult, where I'm now CEO, and I've been CEO for about 6 or 7 months. We're an innovation center, so our job is to help companies, right from the smallest companies, kind of pre-revenue, certainly pre-investment, right up to big multinationals, take advantage of this transition. So that's the heart of our job. Like, somebody comes to us with a widget, can we help them turn that into a business model which is going to be sustainable and going to work? So that's our big focus, is helping them, and that's whether that's testing products and services with real consumers, thinking about what the market size might be using our modeling assets, but it's also a lot of thinking about what the future energy system will be, because it's so regulated, because it is so policy heavy. If we don't advise government to say, these are the rules and regulations you need to change if you want to unlock the kind of innovation you need. So we do, as well as that kind of getting your hands dirty, helping SMEs and others grow, it's crucially thinking about what they're growing into, so what the future system is going to be. So we do a lot of kind of policy work, etc. We're about 250 people based up in Birmingham in the UK. Funnily enough, about 100 yards from where my first job was as a newspaper journalist, an extraordinary life coincidence. And it's a mixture of engineers, of consumer insight experts, of policy people, of digital, of refugees from other sectors who are trying to understand what the hell energy is about, and bring innovation from other sectors into the space. So it's an incredible group of talented people who are trying to help others really thrive in this future space.
Yeah, it's an interesting actually how the name of Energy Systems Catapults really it's almost like the name carries further than the number of you would expect the number of people to take it. So you punch quite well above your weight. Can you give us some examples of the last sort of 5 or 6 years of the successes that ESC have had and the Catapult have had, and where you're kind of particularly proud of the work that the team have done, and where it's actually manifested in the market moving in a different direction, or technologies coming through that would not getting the penetration they needed?
Yeah, that's so good question. So I'll do that on 2 levels. In terms of the kind of the SMEs that we work with, there's been hundreds that we've supported over the past 6-7 years since we've been going. Ones that I'm most excited about. This is really unfair, because this is like naming your favorite children. But ones where we've seen, particularly, we spend a lot of time in the heat space, where we see, it's a big innovation challenge. So companies like Sunamp, based up in Edinburgh, who do thermal batteries, so phase change material, very useful use cases on across
And
the
just
spectrum on heating. So
and,
this is sorry.
and just describe that technology a bit more for us. Just describe
Yeah,
how
so
it works.
this is an alternative to hot water tanks, really.
Yeah.
It's a way of storing heat storage materials, and instead of doing it by heating up water and then dispersing it, they use phase change material, which is much denser, so they can come up with much smaller units for the equivalent amount of heat, and that's very useful in the UK context, where we've ripped out lots of our hot water tanks over the last 15 years,
But loft conversions.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly, loft conversions, etc. But we're going to need storage technologies if you increase heat pumps. But there are loads of other use cases in industrial heat, in lots of other areas, which are really important.
And do they work? Does it have a direct electricity input to generate the heat? Does it sit next to a heat generating unit of whatever type it is, and it's just a heat storage?
Yeah, so you can set it up in different ways, but it's the input into it. Again, set up in different ways, but input typically work with a heat pump,
Right,
as it were. So we'll be providing heat into it in that way, which you can either do electrically or elsewhere. But then it's discharge, probably in the UK systems, because we tend to have wet heating systems, would be like a boiler is heating up water very quickly in that sense. So so it discharge into a wet radiator system, as it were. So you'd be normal central heating in that sense. So Sunamp's one we're very excited about. Evergreen, who up in Manchester, so they do they have a device called a Homely device, which is about joining up heat pumps with the wider energy system. So actually turning on your heating slightly earlier, so that so you don't see any different in the consumer experience, but it reduces the pressure on the grid at peak times, etc. So they've got various other devices they're working in to try and make the smart system work. There's a company called Cero out in Wales who are doing kind of zero carbon buildings and trying to get all of those working. But there's just a kind of a massive stable of cool companies that we've worked with and are moving further up the TRL level. Yeah.
and it's a lot of those sound like the playing with timing is quite an important thing. And back to my reference earlier to the dumb system where you stuff energy down a pipe, and it's just I need hot water, I generate hot water at the moment, I need hot water almost in a lot of combi boiler systems, for example.
If I think of what we're trying to achieve in terms of the where we focus our effort on innovation, it's around the demand side, heat and buildings, whether that's domestic or non-domestic, industrial clusters, etc. So trying to understand that how you can do that in a low carbon way, but also let's think about how this system is actually going to fit together. So how those heating technologies might work with the wider energy system, how we might do clustering, all of those questions. How the hell we're going to get the network to work in a world where we're moving from, as you say, a very dumb system to another one. Those are the big innovation questions we work with at the Catapult. There are other bits of the innovation landscape which work on kind of nuclear technology or renewables or things like that in an upstream context.
I've always wanted to ask this question, and you feel like an informed person I can ask this question to, so dangerous one, right? But time of day shifting, which is an obvious benefit, right? So the principle being that everyone gets up in the morning and they all want to have a shower between 6 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and that therefore is when the grid will take a big surge if everyone was to install a heat pump, for example. So the idea of timing your generation and separating when you generate the heat from when you use the heat, and the same with power potentially if you have power storage, sounds like a good idea. I want to know what happens when you do more and more and more of it. So when you, for example, you do see renewables, EV penetration hitting a certain level, and you see heat pump penetration hit a certain level. Is there a certain point where actually there isn't a rule which says that's peak time, and those are the ones we want to avoid? Have you run those scenarios, and can you talk about what they might look like?
this is it. At the moment, we're all getting excited about this world where I get, I plug my EV in and it charges up overnight between 1 and 4.
I get paid to take the power. Yeah,
I get
exactly.
paid, all of that stuff, which is great and step one. But what we're already seeing we've got a kind of 1700, 1800, what we call our living lab homes. So these are real people's homes. And what we're seeing, their profiles are changing entirely if they've got EVs. And they're basically, they have their peak between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., right? And of course, if you have the whole system turning on like that and turning off at different points, you just create another peak somewhere else. So the next phase of where it's exciting from an innovation point of view is how you're going to stagger all of that activity, and basically that you smooth it as much as possible on a kind of, on a local and a national basis to line up with the technology at the kind of generation end, etc. So you've got all of that going. One thing I would say is there's a kind of perception sometimes in the energy debate that this flexibility, this moving energy around during the time, battery storage, load shifting, etc., is going to solve all the world's problems. But it is really important, and your system's not going to work on a day-to-day basis without it. But you still need to solve for the biggest problem in the future energy system at the moment, as we can see, which is what happens when the wind does not blow for 2 weeks. Right?
Yes.
Because there's only so many batteries or storage technologies, etc., that you can have. And at the moment, we solve that problem with big lumps of coal and a very big gas grid, which can store that energy, and it can be used whenever we want. That's much harder in a windy system with a much more electrified demand side. So you still can't get away from the need for big sources of generation, which are just going to fill those gaps, which are flat and fill out those gaps. And that is, and we can't get away from that. And there's quite a lot of wishful thinking in the space that we're not going to do that. And our modeling scenarios would always bump up against that challenge. What do we, even if you're a very flexible system intraday,
yes,
it's the intraseasonal stuff, which is or the 2 week no wind.
Well, it was the I think I quoted this recently I might have been on the last podcast I did actually, but there was the January 2020 had 41% of the power in the UK came from offshore wind or wind in general, and in 2021 January it was 2%. Just as an example. And so what's the direction of travel in the UK to addressing that? And in the UK, I think has actually quite an extreme challenge with this, where we've had such success with renewables penetration. And at the same time, I think we've failed to invest in baseload replacement in a way that some of the other markets around the world have. What are you seeing in terms of trending in the UK, and where do you think the government are going on this?
So if I'm being brutally honest, I don't think we've kind of grasped this question.
We haven't got one
as much as we should be, right? Belatedly, we are seem to be pushing more effort into replacement nuclear space after not doing anything from 30 years, but it's taking a while. And that's at the kind of large scale nuclears, your 2-3 gigawatt scale, and we're making progress there. But it's not clear that that's going to be the only thing that we need, right? We've made big announcements in 2015 around small modular reactors, and here we are, kind of 7 or 8 years later, not having
still making big announcements, but not doing anything.
Big announcements, not enough kind of on the ground. Although it's a really kind of fertile area of innovation and investment. It's really interesting starting to see direct investment into there. So. And we're not doing enough on kind of market reform to provide the price signals so that people providing flexibility can get really excited about what this future market might be in the UK context. And so it's work in progress, but the pace needs to up. Otherwise, the kind of as I talk about, the creaking of the system is just going to get worse and worse.
And we've talked a little bit today. I mean, it's amazing how quickly the conversation we talk about energy turns into a conversation about consumers. And their homes and their EVs, but that's only a percentage of the mix. And it'd be interesting to get your views on industrial UK and this sort of industrial challenge, and what are you seeing there at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we think about what big innovation challenges you are. Absolutely. Like, how are you going to get consumers on this journey to net zero? How are you going to hold their hand through getting low carbon heating system installed, whether that's a heat network or a heat pump or
And how much,
hydrogen, or whatever it is. Yeah.
and in that, by the way, so before we get into the industrial bit, how important is choice in that for you, like in your research and your analysis?
It's, well, consumers definitely want choice as a starting point, but actually the greater motivation is confidence that whatever this new technology is, lots of which they won't be familiar in a UK context with, even though they've been around for a long time, that it's that rather, is it going to get my house warm, and is it going to be a reasonable cost? And they're more worried about that than they are about the choice aspect. I think that is the big challenge for the heating industry, because some of these will be monopoly choices, particularly around heat networks, etc. So I think choice is important, but it's more important. The barriers we see to low carbon heating are unfamiliarity with the technology and is this going to get my house warm?
I mean, I would describe myself as a relatively informed buyer. So I kind of know what I'm talking about, but I also don't in some ways. And so if I found myself in an argument with my plumber recently because he was basically refusing to specify a heat pump for my house. And
right,
come on, man. I even got a design from another company, provided it to him. Because of the size of my property, and it's an old house and it's in a cold north side of a hill. You're going to need 2 heat pumps. So you're going to need a large buffer vessel. Interestingly, I hadn't heard them talk about sun amp, so I'm going to go back to them about sun amp. But I gave this to my plumber, and he said, "No, I would never install that because I don't want to stand behind that work. I don't think it will work for you. I don't think it'll keep your house warm. I think you'll come back and complain to me about it." And it strikes me that there just are millions and millions of tradesmen up and down the UK, tradespeople that are doing this work that just don't understand these new technologies. And there also doesn't seem to be any plan to say, how does Mike's plumber find out about the fact that this does actually work?
Yeah,
It works in places that are colder than the UK. And you don't have to spend £50,000 on insulation for it to work. It can still work anyway. You can get a flow temperature of 60 degrees out of a heat pump and it'll be absolutely fine, which is also fine for heating my house. So that's a personal rant rather than a question, to be honest with you.
No, I agree with you. We do 30,000 heat pumps installs in the UK. We're probably maybe more like 40,000 this year, versus 1.5 million boilers, right? It takes a lot. Yeah, boilers. It takes a lot of time to move that supply chain. And you've got the median age. Sorry, go on.
You've got big moves recently, though. I mean, I think British Gas have come out and said they're going to move into heat pumps in a big way. They're going to retrain all their employees. I think Octopus have launched a product, £3,500. They turned me down. I registered on their website and said, "Nah, it's too complicated." They only want to do the easy ones. But it does seem to be that the market's taking off, and there's a lot of big people investing.
So we talked about consumers. What's the other big innovation areas or big innovation needs we know? One absolutely is the kind of less sexy part of the energy industry, which is around how you're going to decarbonize kind of pockets of industrial clusters. That's a big challenge in the UK. So when you've got chemicals, plants, areas which are linked up potentially with a power station or something like that, or you've got ceramics as you've got in different parts of the country, or any of these kind of big industrial processes. How are you going to think about what the integrated solution to the energy needs of that? And that'll be a mixture of heat and electricity, etc. And it's one thing which is a real systems challenge, because you need to understand the different demands of all the different participants, because what you typically get is industrial areas, because of years of different companies popping up and different relationships, you've got that slightly kind of odd mix of people in a particular site. So you could have a world where everyone does their own individual thing, but that would be an incredibly inefficient way to do it. It's much better if we think about solutions which will and crucially will say, what are the steps that different areas need to take? So we see that kind of non-domestic industrial clusters, as well as kind of commercial complex sites, as it were, whether that's a port or a or a prison or a NHS complex or whatever, or a university, how all of those are going to navigate to net zero is a massive challenge. So that's number two, I think, and the third one is just how the hell we're going to make all these networks work together in the system, join up. Those are the three big innovation challenges we see. One is a consumer, and the latter two are very much kind of system-y, how's this all going to fit together kind of questions. Again, it's that integration, which is as big an innovation challenge as coming up with a new technology. That's what we see as going to be the big thing over the next 10 to 15 years.
And I think for some of those sectors, it's business critical. We're talking 50, 60, 70% of their operating costs are energy.
Yeah.
And the crisis that we've had in the last 2 years around energy prices in the UK has just really brought this to the fore. Can we keep industry in the UK? This is stacked on top of, labour prices are higher in the UK than they will be in other markets where they can be comparing us to. So I think this is really at the heart of a competitive Britain. What are we going to be in 50 years? What kind of country are we going to have industry? Or not even 50 years, 15 years. So I one last question to leave you with, and it's a grand question. I'm going to appoint you Prime Minister for the day for this podcast, Prime Minister for the 5 minutes that we have left in our podcast, and you can do anything you want. You've got a massive majority, which means that you haven't got anyone in your own party trying to come at you from the right or the left to undermine your intensity of your commitment, which means you can go and do anything. I'm just very interested in, what would be the 2 or 3 things that you would like to do in the energy space and that you would put in place?
So the things that would make the biggest difference to the 2 questions I worry about all the time, which is how are we going to get this net zero system to work at the pace and scale we need, and how are we going to do that in a way which is going to encourage the innovation and the innovators that we work with, and we're kind of very proud of being part of our stable to transform that future system. I'm going to allow 2 things if that's possible. One is we have got to get the market design aligned with the physics of this new system. So that means more locational pricing, clearer incentives in terms of doing the low carbon thing is also the cheaper thing. All of that needs to be fixed. And there's a big lot of work and activity around that, but getting those market signals aligned, that's the most important thing for innovators. Because that's the thing that they can take to investors saying, that's a real market, I'm going after that. I don't have to lobby government for everything. I can get a real price.
Yeah.
So that's my number 1. My number 2 is if you had a really good majority, is taking on planning, because we are, even in this very smart, flexible world, we're going to have to build a lot of pipes and wires in particular, like a lot of heat networks, a lot of new nuclear, new renewables, and we're going to have to join all of them up together. And we've become very, very slow at that in the UK. So streaming up that process, more strategic planning, and then pushing it through, even in the face of local opposition.
That was going to be my question. Would you do more? Would you do more of it at a national level? Would you take more control of the design and implementation of the energy system at a national level? Because take heat networks, for example. One of the things I've always been frustrated about them is they're always done very locally, which means they always end up with less resource and less focus on them than you could get if they were declared to be nationally critical infrastructure, which they should be. You can decarbonise the city of Manchester if you do it well with a heat network, but it's really hard to do it if it's just a local authority doing it, and they've had budget cuts for 15 years. So I'm going to be a real systems thinker and say you need to do it at both levels, right? You need them all.
Well, we do not have in the UK, and you and I have talked about this in the past, a system for local area energy planning. So absolutely, and then you need to fit that into the national system and identify the national priorities, and you kind of zoom in and out between those 2, as we do with transport and things like that. that will give us a transport planning, I should say, that will give us a much better chance of cutting through this, because you've agreed a plan at a local level which fits with the national strategic plan, and both elements should be able to say, right, it's in the plan, we can go ahead with that heat network, we can go ahead with that transmission upgrade, we can go ahead with digging up the roads in this area, because from a system point of view, it's absolutely essential. Now, you have to involve, but your planning process is how you get local consent, not once you've decided on the project, which is, we do it the wrong way around, I feel.
Okay, good. I lied. I have one more question for you, which is my standard question I like to end these things with. You jump yourself forward in 20, 30 years, and you're sitting with your pipe and your slippers somewhere near Birmingham, presumably, and you're looking back on your career. What do you want your legacy to be? What do you want to reflect back on and be remembered for?
I would love as many as possible, but at least, 3 or 4 of the companies that we work with, Energy Systems Catapult, have grown to be absolutely powerhouses of the transition, and they're employing thousands of people, and they are coming up with good solutions for consumers, and they're helping make that transition as easy as possible. If we've helped a few of them absolutely thrive and become, multinational success stories for the UK economy, that's the thing I get out of bed for, to help. So yeah, I've mentioned a few that could be potential. There's loads more that are in our kind of portfolio who could be we're really excited about. But yeah, if we were able to help them in a little bit, and they could say, you know what, there's a bit of success that's thanks to the energy system.
We had a leg up. Yeah,
I'd be delighted.
Yeah. Very nice. Guy, thanks very, very much indeed. Really appreciate the time today. I know how busy you are, and look forward to seeing the Energy Systems Catapult. Maybe going, do you do any work stateside?
Yeah, we do bits, but we're looking at more and more. So
we might see you more over there.
Please get in touch. Anyone who needs any systems thinking and learn the hard lessons, and as well as some exciting companies, do get in touch.
Magic. Thank you, my friend. Really appreciate it. I'll let you get on with your Monday.
Cheers, Mike.
Thanks, everybody.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.